Greetings, brothers and sisters in Christ. It's good to have you back for another James Bible study. Today we're looking at the rest of chapter 3 and a little bit of chapter 4. And we'll talk a little bit about why I kind of split where I did split and why I grouped the texts as I do, because we're kind of stopping at a weird point that doesn't sort of fit our Bible subheadings and whatnot. So we're going to jump in. We're going to look at 3:13 through 4:3. So we're going to start at chapter 3, verse 13. We're going to go to 4, verse 3, and that's going to be this first the section we're going to look at in this video. So let's jump into the text. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. And you ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. Okay. So that's the text. Looking at how we kind of divide the text a little bit here. So this is different based on which commentator or theologian you're referencing. So one of the things when you're using multiple commentaries, when you're looking at different theologians' approach to text, one of the things that's never the same, and I don't know why. I don't know why. No one ever agrees how to subdivide the texts. So when is an author done making a certain point and moving on to the next point? That's what I mean by subdividing. What's a chunk of text? Because, again, as I've said in multiple videos, subheadings are not inspired. James did not write wisdom from above when he transitioned sections. The manuscripts have just one long, series of text with sentence breaks sometimes. And again, they don't have punctuation, which I mentioned in another video. So they don't have sentence or periods at the end of sentences necessarily. Though they do have ways to mark the end of sentences, usually by the type of verb that they use. Kind of like German in that sense. There's some similarities with how German sentences and Greek sentence manuscripts kind of work together. When a sentence is done because the verb comes at the end in German. Same sort of thing. And really, you see a lot of that in Paul. I don't know if that's why Pauline theology and German thought kind of goes hand in hand. That's a subtopic for another day. But anyway, so because we don't have subheadings that are inspired and things are one long sort of manuscript with just text after text after text after text and no real divisions, because we don't have verse numbers and we don't have chapter head numbers, so there's no way to sort of subdivide. It's just a letter or it's just a book, and there's no headings and things like that. That comes later in the manuscript tradition. So when we make decisions about where the beginning and end of thought is at, we influence what informs and is the main thought. Okay, so this happens, so I see this a lot when we're going through Luke in the Sunday morning Bible class, that depending on where you cut the end of the section determines the context of the point. So I remember when we were talking about Luke, and this was probably a full year ago at this point, when Luke introduces the parable of the sower, he does not do as Matthew does and then gives an explanation of the parable, then goes into the parable of the wheat and the tares, and then sort of goes into another parable, and so this whole teaching section. Instead, the parable of the sower begins a chapter, and then everything that follows in the chapter as a narrative in some way reflects the parable, the teaching point of the parable. And so you sort of see a fruit or a seed scattered on the road and it's rejected, or you see faith take hold but then fade away, or you see a seed take hold, take root, and begin to grow and harvest. And so you sort of see these examples of the parable in the narrative, and that's sort of how James presents information. Well, when does that stop? When does Luke stop using the narrative as a further evidence of the parable preaching point? Well, you have to make a decision. Does this connect? And is it okay if there's space in between? So if Luke takes a break and mentions something over here and then comes back to it and it seems clear that this really does connect to that, is it okay that there's this gap in the structure? So, those sort of decisions are relevant, and it's especially relevant as we sort of deal with James. Now, James is especially difficult because we don't know exactly what kind of style he's writing in. So James, when we look at James as a whole, and its structure and its story and its form of argument, looking at it as a literary piece, it's not like a Pauline epistle where you have tight arguments. So Paul, when he writes a letter, you can tell he's making an argument. Here's point A, point B, point C. Here's subpoint, 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 back to point D, and the argument progresses. And this was actually an assignment at seminary. You take a chunk of Pauline text and you list out how it makes an argument and all the different pieces of his argument, and you label it. This is this thing. This is this thing. This is this thing, and this is how it all flows together. And here's the text, and here's the center of the argument and the point that he makes and how he makes it. Okay, so you can do that with Paul. James isn't like that. James doesn't structure his epistle that way. He doesn't use sort of Hellenistic rhetoric or a sort of structure, and we don't have sort of the examples we have of things like James have a tendency to be sort of, I think I said this in the first video, sort of wisdom literature. Like the closest we have to James in the Bible is Proverbs. And yeah, Proverbs has a bit of a structure to it, but it's kind of all over the place at times because it's sort of giving instruction, giving encouragement. Here's a piece of advice on this thing. Here's a piece of advice on this thing. Well, here's a subsection here on wisdom. Here's a subsection here over on money. We have the last chapter of Proverbs about the Proverbs 31 woman, and what is that's sort of a section on its own. And so there isn't people argue about Proverbs' structure as well in the same way they argue about James, because which piece of advice ties in with another piece of advice. So how does this all fit together? So when we're looking at the text here, we stopped at 13 because here's a subheading. We've shifted from. Now let's back up for a second. If we look at what's came before in the last video, we talked about the tongue. So taming the tongue was the main topic, and we went from taming of the tongue. Okay, this is all about the tongue and how we speak, and he's using all these visual examples. But then we have this shift in 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Okay, well, we've shifted now from tongue to wisdom, and so it seems reasonable that we would have that subheading and that break there in our text. So it sort of points out, hey, we changed topics. Now, why is it if the subject of 13 and following is wisdom, from above, as the subheading says, then we should be able to follow along in the argument. Okay, what comes from above, what's earthly, unspiritual, demonic, and then selfish ambition, and then this contrast of peaceable, gentle, open to reason. Okay, so there's this contrast there. And then he goes into 4 about quarrels and fights. And then, is it not your passions that are at war within you? Well, do quarrels and fights, do quarrels and fights connect with conduct of wisdom? Well, it could. But should we connect the two? Well, if we don't connect the two, let's say we follow the subheadings, we have a shift in chapter 4 fairly early. And so I have this section here, verse 4, you adulterous people. And so in verse 4, and again, I can't scroll the text and write on the screen at the same time. So you just have to try and follow me as best you can. So when verse 4 starts, "You adulterous people," Douglas Moo, who I've been reading fairly heavily when it comes to the James study, points out, hey, that looks like a new address. He's shifted topic here when he gets into "you adulterous people." It's that sort of address that wakes people up and like, oh, okay, that was kind of harsh. What do you have to say to us? And so it's one of those kind of like wake up words or wake up phrases that gets your audience back to paying attention to you. And so if that's what that is, then this must start a new idea. And so the question becomes, well, if that's true, does 1 through 3 support what comes after, or does it go with what comes before? Well, Doug Moo thinks it supports what comes before, and I'm followed him on that in my structuring of texts and studies and sermons. So that's why I'm stopping at verse 3 and not continuing on in chapter 4, even though the subheading kind of would say, oh, you should keep going, or you should have stopped at the end of chapter 3 and started again in chapter 4. So I'm following a different substructure of the letter of James than the people who put the chapter numbers into the text and the subheadings and the breakpoints of the ESV. So 2 groups. One is the ESV subheadings. Second group is the 12th century people who put the chapter numbers in. So we're somewhat veering off from their way of doing things. But you can divide the text any way you want because, as I've said, subheadings, chapter numbers, and verse numbers are not inspired. You can do what you want with them. So this is the text. And what we're gonna work on. So begins with, who is wise and understanding among you? So he starts off with this question, so that puts the topic of wise and understanding center stage. So the opening question has a tendency to tell us what he wants to talk about. By his good conduct, let him show his works. So we've already talked about showing works, right? This was chapter 2, demonstrating your faith through your works. So show his works in the meekness of wisdom. So by his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. So if we're going to tie 3 and 2 together as one cohesive whole, we should recognize wisdom here has something to do with faith as well, because faith and works has already been connected by James. So faith, works, and wisdom all kind of go together, tie together, and it has to do with conduct, but I'm going to put conduct in with works. So who is wise and understanding among you? By his conduct let him demonstrate his works in the meekness of wisdom. So meekness also plays a role. I think meekness and wisdom is the connection of faith and wisdom, because meekness comes from humility, humility comes from faith, and recognizing that you are not enough and Christ has to come and save you. You can't do enough works. You need Christ on the cross too. And by knowing that you hunger and thirst for righteousness, knowing that you are poor in spirit, causes that meekness of wisdom, that meekness of faith. So then he gives a contrast. Again, always be looking for double-mindedness. If you find it in James, you're on the right track about what he's getting after. So here's a contrast between the meekness of wisdom, which I think is faith, hope, and love. Love and works go together. I put it next to wisdom, but it's fine. So faith, hope, and love, faith, works, and wisdom. These are the sort of ideas here. They're going together. And here's the contrast in verse 14. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, not wisdom, works, and faith, do not boast and be false to the truth. So we know, just as people, when we're talking about wisdom, we're hoping truth is not far behind in the conversation. Truth and wisdom go together. And so if you don't have the things that go with wisdom, but instead have their opposites. So if you don't show meekness and understanding and wisdom, then don't expect to find truth when you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. So this is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. So there is wisdom that comes from above, and there is that contrast of earthly wisdom, demonic wisdom. Okay? So he's already set up the contrast between true wisdom and earthly wisdom. So there's that double-mindedness. What kind of wisdom are we going to follow? Are we going to be earthly or heavenly, spiritual or unspiritual, Christ-like or demonic? Okay? Now, he continues with 4, and I talk about how 4 is that pirate word in Greek, gar, which is often explanatory about what comes before. And it serves that purpose sometimes, most of the time in English too. So it's not too difficult to sort of, hey, there's a 4 there. What is it going to tell us about? It's going to tell us about the thing that came before it. Why does he say that earthly wisdom is unspiritual and demonic? Well, for where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, so where they are, it results, there will be disorder and every vile practice. So what is the result of selfish ambition and jealousy? What's the result of following this kind of wisdom? The answer is disorder and every vile practice. Okay? But what happens if we're following the wisdom from above? Godly wisdom, spiritual wisdom. What are its fruits? Well, it is first of all pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And then there is a harvest of righteousness sown in peace. Okay? So there's a contrast here between two types of wisdom. Again, this is James at its most basic level. He's going to put together two contrasts for his people, and he's going to say, pick one. You have to pick one. You have to live with one. So, I was looking at myself in the screen. I was like, why do I have a white spot on my shirt? It's the microphone. It was off color to the black. Like, doesn't matter. Just threw me off when I looked at it. I've been in the studio too long. Anyway, so when we're looking at James, and whether it's chapter 3, chapter 2, chapter 1, it's all about double-minded. It's all about putting together this contrast. Are you on team A or team B? Team A looks like this. Team B looks like this. You can't look like this and say you're on this team. I used the train model example earlier in chapter 2 in the faith and works stuff. You can't say you're a train model enthusiast and not own any train models. Doesn't make any sense. You can't say you have faith and not have anything sort of to demonstrate it. In the same way, if you're going to be on team A, team wisdom, team meekness, team humility, team faith and works, you have to get rid of jealousy and selfish ambition, because that's the way of the world. The way of the world results in things that are disorderly, against God's will, and it's vile. This, in some sense, is fairly straightforward, much like the earlier part of the video, James chapter 3. If I can simply say in this last part of chapter 3, live and act like someone who believes Jesus is true. That's what he's saying. That's the simple summary of this section. Don't live like the world lives. Don't follow the way of the world. Don't follow the example of the world. Don't follow Gordon Gekko's advice that greed is good. The economist in me kind of wants to say, well, let's hedge that statement a little bit. But we recognize avarice is bad, right? Greed is bad. It's harmful for those around us. It's harmful to our neighbor, harmful to ourselves. And when we start to see people who committing injustices, starting to see people who are walking over others, who are dehumanizing, abusing, in order to get ahead, in order to gain status. I think I said in Bible class today something like, when we put people down, we're always just lifting ourselves up, because we're talking about words and some other stuff, and that when we insult others, we're really just trying to make ourselves feel better, because that's what we're trying to use words to do, is to put one person down and lift ourselves up. That's the way of the world. And so James is saying, well, that's the way of the world, but it's not the way of the kingdom. It's not the way of Christ. It's not the way of the cross. The cross, the way of the kingdom, to be a citizen of the King's kingdom, means that we have other attributes. There's purity, peaceableness, gentleness, open to reason, mercy, fruits, impartial, sincere, righteousness, peace. Peaceable comes up twice. And so he's setting up this contrast. And then the result, he furthers this conversation, and this is why I went into that whole where do we stop and where do we start kind of thing. When we look at, continuing on in chapter 4, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Well, it's ultimately by following the ways of the world. And so this sort of idea continues to flow together. Is it not this, that I'm reading it and not showing it to you. What causes quarrels and fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions, maybe that jealousy and selfish ambition might be in mind here, are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. Okay? So there's a couple different things happening in this part here as well. So when we're thinking about, I'm scrolling up so we can see a bit more behind my head because it's so big on the screen here. There we go. So I've gotten rid of some of the chapter of 3, and we're just going to pay attention to this part here. So the quarrels and fights and passions are all tied together, and that if we're following these lines of pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy, good fruits, you're not going to find these things. These things are found in the world, not in the community of believers, not in the church. Wouldn't that be nice if it was true? However, we still live in the world, and we are still of the world at times. And so there remains quarrels and fights in the church. Wish it were not so. This should not be, as James says. So, is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? So your passions are fighting against each other. This reminds me of Romans chapter 7. The thing I want to do is not the thing that I do, but I do the thing I don't want to do. Those passions, those desires are in conflict, at war with each other. You desire and do not have, so you murder. So you want something. So is the desire good or bad? So we can have good desires, right? So we can have bad desires, good desires. I could desire to serve in some way, or I can desire, the health of my children, or, whatever. There are good things that I can desire, and I can have good ambition as well. Like I may want to, serve in a greater capacity. There are good sides to ambition. And there's good sides to jealousy. For our Lord is a jealous God. Just as there is righteous anger, that doesn't mean anger always leads to righteousness, though. So desire can be good or bad, but we know that James is talking about bad desire because it leads to murder. So if the result of the desire is murder, your desire is not good. You covet. So here we're having another sort of synonym here to desire. What kind of desire? A covetous desire. And you can't get what you want, so you fight and you quarrel. Now, then we sort of get this shift right here, where he stops talking about quarreling and starts talking about asking, because he was talking about cannot obtain, and you don't have. So what is it? Why don't you just ask for it? Well, you do not have because you do not ask. Oh, so we're not asking. You do not ask and you do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. So now we have to kind of go backwards, because James is saying something that he's said before, and it has more context if we put the two things together. So I've already scrolled a bunch in this video, but we're going to scroll again. So we're going to go forward here. We're going to go all the way back to chapter 1. And I'm pretty sure, nope, it wasn't that one. Here it is. So back to chapter 1. So we're right in the beginning. and we have the greeting verses, and we have count it all joy, dealing with trials, and then we get to verse 5. Verse 4 and 5. Let's look at verse 4 and 5. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And then in verse 5, I'm going to write on the screen so you can follow along better. So right here, if any one of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God. Oh, in chapter 1, verse 5, James ties together wisdom and asking, right? So those two ideas are tied together. Now, what did I say earlier about how we connect the ideas of wisdom and what follows in the fighting and quarreling and asking? Well, James has already connected the idea of wisdom with asking. And let him ask God, who gives generously to all. So he gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that's driven, tossed by the wind. For the person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. So, the double-minded, which, as we have seen throughout James's letter, means the earthly or the unspiritual, right? So the double-minded man is earthly and unspiritual. He's unstable in all his ways because he's a hypocrite. He won't receive anything from the Lord. Why? Well, we don't get back to that why question until we're in chapters 3 and 4. So if we go backwards again, or scroll forwards, dun, 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 we're now back to this text. And so we have the beginning of wise and understanding, seeking wisdom, and now we're back here to ask and asking wrongly, because you do not ask. What are we asking for? We're asking for wisdom. What kind of wisdom? Well, wisdom from above. That's pure, peaceable, gentle, da-da-da-da-da-da. So, but you ask and do not receive. Why wouldn't I not receive? Oh, I'm asking wrongly. Why? Because I'm double-minded. I don't want the wisdom from above. I want the wisdom to accomplish my passions. I want the wisdom that comes down, not from down below, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. Why? Because I want to win my quarrels and fights. That's how it all ties together. So we take verses from chapter 1 because we see chapter 1 as an introduction to the whole thing. So when James introduces an idea in chapter 1, he's going to come back to it again later on in the epistle. Here in the epistle, we see that he's tying together, or he's further expounding the verses in 5, 6, and 7 about the connection of wisdom from above and asking in prayer and asking wrongly. And so when we put the two texts side by side, and we recognize, wisdom comes by asking the Lord, and he will give us wisdom if we ask for it without reproach. He won't reject our prayers so that we may begin to act as he has instructed us, peaceably, righteously, gently, with mercy, so on and so forth, because the wisdom that we ask for is from above, from God, is Christ-like. However, he will reject our prayer for wisdom when we want more wisdom to win our earthly battles of manipulation and of jealousy and ambition and selfishness, of coveting and murderousness. Why would God empower us with his wisdom to do evil? Well, he won't. So he will reject your prayer because you are a double-minded hypocrite who wants to pursue the ends of the earthly realm and reject the life of the kingdom. This is why prayers are rejected. What you ask for, and the reason you ask for it, is so that your life on earth would be better and not to be advantage to the kingdom, to the community of believers, to Christ's service. It doesn't serve Christ, it serves you and your ambitions, your jealous rage, your murderous thoughts, your covetousness. So, and that's in the sermon that I did on this text, I ended with the sort of thought of we need to examine our prayers. We need to think about what it is that we're asking of God, and are we asking in faith? And are we asking for the wisdom from above for the ends of things that serve the above? Are we wanting God to help us win the lottery so we can be rich, full of status and honor, and people will respect us and they'll notice us and they'll know us and we'll be celebrities and so on and so forth? Or do we ask God to continually provide for us and provide for those around us, not worrying about lottery or hitting it rich or becoming a celebrity or sort of having these selfish ambitions, but instead, give me your wisdom so I can serve the kingdom? And here, when we think about wisdom, who do we think of? We think of Solomon. What did Solomon ask for? Why do we think of Solomon and wisdom together? Well, because Solomon asked for the wisdom to do what? To care for the kingdom given to him as king of God's people. And so, yes, he could have asked for status and honor and wealth and all these things, but instead he asked for wisdom from above so that he could be a good king of God's people. This is why Solomon is lifted up in Scripture. And so he was wise in the ways of the things that are above for the people of God. And so his wisdom served a specific end, namely God's goals and what he desired. So that's what we are to do in our prayers, and our wisdom is to seek the kingdom and its life and the life in Christ. Okay, I hope that was helpful and explanatory. We don't get into the rough section of chapter 4 quite yet, which is what I started with Ash Wednesday sermons, was this adulterous people. So when we get to 4, verse 4 to 10, James he gets to the heart of it, right? He really expands upon this idea of double-mindedness. What does double-mindedness look like? And what it looks like is adultery. It's not just hypocrisy, but adultery to the relationship between you and God. And so 4 to 10 is this heart of the sinful nature of man, which I thought was fitting for Ash Wednesday, when we sort of come to repent of our sinful nature and the things that we do and don't do and all that. So that's where we're at in the text. We're going to pick up on that theme for next time. So I hope this video was helpful and insightful, and that you gained something from it. And then I will see you next time when we talk about you adulterous people. Have a good rest of your week.